Okay, look.
Where am I standing over here? Over there?
Let me see your good side first of all. That's your good side. That's the best side.
How are you doing, folks? Good evening. You're all very, very welcome back. The summer has flown, a beautiful summer's evening for us all to be here. So Cade Míle Fáilte go léir, you're all very welcome back, Arish, to our Historical Society. Our Historical Society, some of you might be familiar with, there's no membership fee. The fact that you're here, you're a member of the society. If you're objectionable or something, the lads up the front here should be out. All right, lads? Do the business? No. Anyway, just before we introduce tonight's lecture, just to throw it out there and just to mention to you, normal housekeeping rules apply. Try to just take the phone, if you put the phone on silent, please. In the event of an emergency, straight out the door you've just come in, up the stairs and away to your left hand side, or just follow Anne. Anne, where are you?
I'm here.
Yeah, we're all following you in the event of the emergency.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so you know the way out of the building. Just up the steps and away to your left hand side. And just to let you know, we'll give you more details, but we're doing a trip to the GA Museum on the 14th of October. We'll announce that later on this month. In the meantime, just another item just thrown out to you. Some of you are familiar with, or at our AGM, that we are producing a play for 1916 in March of 1916. Over 3 days, the play will be on 2 performances each day in the Rua Red Theatre, just beside us here. Now, tickets will be at a premium because capacity is quite limited, and already we have a lot of people actually looking to get tickets from us. But the play is based on the writings of Elizabeth O'Farrell. So it's based on Elizabeth O'Farrell's account of the evacuation of the GPO and the surrender, followed by the court-martial and the executions. So that promises to be at the moment now. Rehearsals are taking place for that play, and we'll give you more information closer to the date. In the meantime, tonight we have Jerome Devitt with us. Jerome here is with us tonight, and Jerome is going to give us a wonderful lecture on defending Irish from the Irish. So things haven't really changed, Jerome. So without further ado, Jerome, they're all yours.
Delighted to see so many people here tonight. If you're still here at the end, I'll consider the minor victory. Just thanks very much to Anne and the committee for the invitation to come and speak here today. I'm a third year, almost fourth year doctoral student in Trinity College at the moment, but I'm also, my day job is that I'm a secondary school teacher up the road in Palmerstown. Someone described me the last time I gave a talk as a secondary school teacher with ideas above his station. So that's only mostly true. I'm wary, most of my research is based around military history, and I'm wary of getting bogged down in military terminology, especially given that I'm talking about a lot of British military institutions and how they operated in Ireland. So if there's anything I say that is confusing or daunting, don't be afraid to throw the hand up. I'm well used to being interrupted. I might tell you to shush very quickly and your attention, but that's a risk of the game. So, the basic idea behind my research is to look at security infrastructure, which is a very fancy way of saying shifting the question from why did the Fenian Rising in 1867 fail, getting rid of that question and flipping it on its head and saying, well, why is it that the British succeeded in stopping that rising? Okay, and what this equates to in kind of modern parlance, if you were talking to a group of military people, they would say that this is a counterinsurgency story. Okay, the nature of recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan has resulted in a lot of spilt ink over counterinsurgency, and the outcome is a number of competing counterinsurgency theories. But if you boil it down to their core elements, what you come up with after reading a lot of very stodgy military doctrine is the need to plan, build, maintain and adapt forces to engage in multiple mutually supporting COIN activities. COIN is the military phrase, so they can sound smarter than they maybe are, that's used to denote counterinsurgency, the first genius of taking the first two letters of the two words. Now, unfortunately for me, there's not a big stock of photographs of the British Army in Ireland in the 1860s, so I'm going to cheat just for a second to illustrate a point. Here is a picture of a US Marine in Afghanistan, I think, in Helmand in Afghanistan, out there winning hearts and minds by engaging with the local community, winning hearts and minds. This is what it's supposed to look like. Invariably, however, it ends up looking something like this. I have a number of little kids at home, and that's a disturbingly familiar sight. It turns out, though, that one of the interesting things is that in 1867, and in the period building up to that, the Irish executive, which is kind of the umbrella term we give to the political administration of Ireland, were running a pretty comprehensive and pretty successful counterinsurgency program. They didn't call it counterinsurgency, the word didn't exist until the 1950s and 60s really, but effectively that's what they were doing. They were out trying to win and function on political and military levels. And those levels interacted quite a lot, surprisingly large amount. But probably the most important element that decides how successful one of these counterinsurgency programs is how well it's coordinated. The first person we have a look at today is the Viceroy, in this case the Liberal Viceroy from 1864 to mid-66, his name was John Woodhouse. So popular were the Fenians that they called him the Woodlouse. And he was kind of a micromanager. He spent a lot of time in Dublin Castle and got the nickname the best clerk in Dublin Castle. He was around from November 64 to the summer of 1866. So he wasn't there for the actual rising, but a lot of what happened on his watch, the preparations, getting the infrastructure in place. He was so successful, in fact, that Queen Victoria promoted him he was a baron, and he was promoted to the Earl of Kimberley for his efforts. So it was a well rewarded for his time. You can kind of think of him, that's a kind of a slightly older painting of him, think of him somewhat like me, kind of late 30s, fairly diligent, well-intentioned, but really wants to make a good impression on people when he meets them. So that's the way to think of him. The second kind of main player here is the commanding general in Ireland, a guy called Sir Hugh Rose, later Baron Strathnairn. And he basically inherited, sorry, my wife thinks this PhD is going to kill me, so put that in there. He's a guy who served in Ireland as a junior officer, a major in the 1830s, and gained extensive experience, military and diplomatic, during the Crimean War, and was in India, and was one of the most successful commanders of the British Army during the Indian Mutiny in 1857. And was the head, in fact, of the Indian Army in the period from 1867 right up until he arrived in Ireland. He literally came from India straight on the boat to Ireland in the summer of 1865. So he was bringing with him enormous military and diplomatic experience. So these are kind of two of the key players, and I think your man looks so bedraggled by that experience. One of the reports, the Lord Lieutenant says, he looks pretty well at least as you can expect from someone who's after spending the last 10 years in India, which took its toll on many soldiers. Many of them were Irish. Let me just kind of hint briefly at the methodology, how I go about doing my research. The biggest challenge for me is that within kind of Irish historiography, within the way the Irish history books are written, there's a seemingly inevitable tendency to lump all elements of British institutions and their military under the ubiquitous phrase, the cover-all phrase, the Crown Forces. That's a phrase you hear a lot. But what does it actually really mean? And that's one of the things I'm trying to tease apart. When we peel back the veneer, we see a far more complex and subtle set of organisations. You can't read them there. Some of the people that I deal with: the Army, the Militia, the Royal Irish Constabulary, the Dublin Metropolitan Police, the Navy, the Coast Guard, the Royal Marines, the RMs, the resident magistrates, the consuls and the diplomats, and the law officers, your Solicitor General, your Attorney General. And the way in which all of these different groups, all with their own interests, the way they interact has a fundamental impact on how successful any policy that's implemented in Ireland might be. Some of these are controlled directly by the Irish Executive. The Irish Executive is your Chief Secretary, your Under Secretary, the guy who kind of runs Ireland. In this case, it's Sir Thomas Larkin, and the Lord Lieutenant. The Chief Secretary was nearly always a member of the British Cabinet, except for this period, because Woodhouse was such a man-manager that he said, well, if you put him in the Cabinet, I'm quitting, I'm going home. So we tried to hog the limelight a little bit, which sometimes managers do, you have to believe. So the real challenge for me is trying to tease out the relationship between all these groups and the Irish Executive, but also the relationship between all these groups and each other. The army operates in collaboration with the militia oftentimes, except when they very consciously don't. The RIC is at large times fairly dependent on the army for its logistical support and backup. You can see this at election time when the army is bringing voters to the polls. You see this constantly, this whole set of regulations set up. It's such a common occurrence that they have sets of regulations telling the army how they can behave when they're helping the police force. So that's really the challenge. I'm not going to get to cover all of these in the kind of 35-40 minutes ahead. I'll start off with the Navy and mention a few of the other little bits and pieces. I'll spend a bit of time on the Army. I won't go into enormous detail on the RIC. Their role in the Rising is fairly well documented and would be reasonably well known. They were in fact the Irish Constabulary until 1867. They only became known as the Royal Irish Constabulary in honour of their efforts in containing the Fenians. In many ways, the Constabulary were the eyes and ears of Dublin Castle. The DMP, the Dublin Metropolitan Police, had the political division, the G division that we'd be familiar with from 1916 and from the War of Independence and so on. They had about 20 political policemen, as they'd been called, and had some quite notable intelligence gathering successes, but also some failures which have gone unacknowledged. If anyone wants to ask me about them later, feel free to ping me in Q&A. So what makes this project really interesting to me is that it's not just an island story. It's a counterinsurgency campaign that works transnationally and transatlantically. Because the Fenian organisation isn't just an Irish organisation. It started in March 1858 on Lombard Street, James Stephens, but it always had an American dimension to it. And so if you're planning to defend Ireland from the Irish, you're talking about defending them internally against the IRB and externally from the possibility of the American Fenians, as they were known, the possibility of them returning. The phrase they used for this at the time was called a filibustering expedition. It's a very fancy way of saying getting on a boat and going and invading somewhere. And there was all kinds of filibustering expeditions going on. Eventually, kind of one of the proofs of the pudding, I suppose, in terms of the success of the British defence of Ireland, is that the American Fenians are so discouraged about the possibility of effectively attacking Ireland that they go off and invade Canada a couple of times. The 150th anniversaries of which will be coming up next year. The Irish Canadian Parks Foundation, for example, are very excited about this. But you can go, if you ever visit Niagara Falls, take a turn left in Niagara and head down the road, you'll find the Battle of Ridgeway site. There's a little monument and you can go and walk the battlefield. It's quite nice. A very good book about it as well called Ridgeway. And it was one of the things that helped to bring the modern Canadian state that we know of, helped to bring that together very clearly, because the Fenian threat unified my enemy's enemy is my friend in this instance. All the Canadian maritime provinces that were under threat ended up kind of uniting, or it helped unite, under an Irishman, partially Thomas D'Arcy McGee, a former Young Irelander. So these are all, when I'm talking about a transnational organisation and a transnational movement, the way in which you defend in Ireland is dependent. The way in which you defend in Ireland is dependent on all these other external factors. And one of the most important of them, I suppose, then is the Royal Navy. Now, the Royal Navy, for anyone who's familiar with it, is probably one of the most important international organisations of the 19th century. Pax Britannica. They ruled. Britannia literally ruled the waves. So if you wanted to get from America to Ireland, you were going to come across the Royal Navy somewhere, and I'll talk a little bit about them. I've always been particularly interested in the Royal Navy in Ireland in the 19th century. Far too interested for common sense, but it's a constant presence here from 1843 onwards, really. So just very, very briefly then, what I'll deal with today is kind of, just briefly I'll talk about the historiography, the way in which this stuff has been written about, and the way in which that tends to influence later research. A little bit, I've talked a little bit already about the nature and the deterrence of the threat. It's very difficult to be an historian who studies deterrence, because it's trying to account for what hasn't happened and why it didn't happen. It's like the Sherlock Holmes story where there's the dog that didn't bark. Remember that story? So why didn't he bark? Well, was there a dog there in the first place? Should he be barking? All these kind of you run the risk of counterfactual history. So what you can do to get around that is say, well, why did they think what they did was successful? So you have to scour pretty hard to find why they thought, through the archive, to find that kind of information. And then some of the conclusions will be along the bottom there, just the way in which the civilian institutions were made more military, and the way in which the military institutions were made more civilian in Ireland. Tended to clump these things all together. I think that's part of the reason why, when someone says the Crown Forces, it's because there didn't always seem to be an enormous difference from the outside. One uniform looked much the same as another. And that's one thing I think we keep in the back of our minds. To be fair to it though, the 1867 rebellion, of all the Irish rebellions, is the least studied. Falling as it does between the cataclysm of the famine of the 1840s, the emergence of the powerful constitutional movement, the Home Rule Party, under Charles Stewart Parnell in the 1870s and 1880s. The Fenian Rising in 67 provided fewer martyrs when compared to 1916 and the Anglo-Irish War, and a mere fraction of the terror tactics employed by the IRA during the Troubles. The general thrust of the historiography of the period seeks to address, as I said, why the IRB Fenians failed. And we can turn that on its head and say, how did the British succeed so emphatically in containing, dismembering, literally chopping the head off, getting rid of the leaders, dismembering and dissuading what to this point seemed like the best poised and best resourced rising in Irish history. It did, after all, have the possibility of drawing on the talents of almost 200,000 Irishmen who served in the American Civil War, whose story has been told really well recently by Damien Shields and a number of other historians. So these, 180, 200,000 Irish guys were military veterans. They knew exactly what they were doing, and a lot of them were poised to come back to Ireland. So how do you influence those guys? In the period leading up to the Troubles in the early 70s, only one historian whose interests were primarily political and administrative history focused on the British side of the period I'm talking about. And that's Leon O'Brien, and he's got an interesting book, Fenian Fever, An Anglo-American Dilemma. And in it he examined the up to that point, untapped records of Dublin Castle at the time of the outbreak. The most prolific and considered of the historians who deals with this is Orvie Comerford, formerly of Maynooth, in his book Fenians and Contexts, Irish Politics and Society, 1848 to 82. And he presents Fenianism as kind of a quasi-social movement. It's a pastime. Patriotism as pastime is the phrase he uses. And that's caused a lot of contention over the years. It's an interesting way to look at it. But it doesn't always focus on the role of the various different organisations that I look at. More recently, with the gradual solidification of the peace process and the institutions of the power-sharing executive, you can tell this, I wrote this before the news bulletins today, which I've seen pretty bleak about the Northern Executive. A glut of detailed scholarly attention was refocused on the early Fenians, coinciding with the 150th anniversary of the formation of the Fenians in 2008. And yes, Patrick's Day, that would have been Patrick's Day, 1858. Of this renaissance in Fenian studies, only one really tackled the perspectives that I'm interested in. That's a book by a guy called Brian Jenkins, a Canadian, for the sake of it. It's called The Fenian Problem, Insurgency and Terrorism in the Liberal State, 1858 to 74. Now my period is deals more with conventional warfare rather than terrorism. And there is obviously a very stark difference to that. Oftentimes the Fenians of the late 1860s are portrayed as the proto-terrorists. That is a little contentious to say that. I wouldn't fully agree with it. There are people who push that interpretation fairly strongly. They look at things like the Clerkenwell prison bombing in December 1867, which is really, from the documentation that I've read at the time, is a botched prison break rather than a terror attack that we would think of now. The dynamite campaign of the 1880s is far more obviously, to my mind anyway, based on O'Donoghue Ross's terror tactics and the skirmishing fun. So very briefly, what is the nature of the actual threat? What are the Fenians doing that needs to be defended against? So I've divided this up into home front and America. One of the big things they said, well, God, look, we've got 28% of the British Army are Irish born. Why don't we just recruit those guys? So as various different British Army regiments rotated into Ireland, they sent guys like Rowntree, Pagan O'Leary, and ultimately John Devoy would be the most well-known of the Fenians who was involved in trying to infiltrate the British Army. And at different times they claimed grossly overinflated numbers. But this really worried the Army High Command in Ireland. We've got to sort this out. But luckily, they rotated the army around, sent them off to different areas as a part of their imperial troop policy, which basically exported the problem. So that every time a new regiment came in, they had to start from scratch. Some of the regiments, though, were pretty well infiltrated. The 61st Regiment, for example, had, of 700 odd guys, 717 in that regiment, they reckoned that around 450 had Fenian sympathies. Not all of them would have taken the Fenian oath, but sometimes you don't need somebody to be on your side, you just need nothing to be on the enemy side, as they perceived it. So this is a big problem. The recruiting and training of native Irish guys, so this is lads flying up into the hills, marching down with hurleys for a while, let's try and get some weapons in. And they had the mouthpiece then as well, the Irish People newspaper. And one of the big intelligence gathering expeditions was when this newspaper was eventually shut down and they raided the offices on September 15th, 1865 and found loads of Fenian documentation with loads of plans. So they had a big intelligence scoop which stopped. 1865 was supposed to be the year of action. This is when it's all going to happen, said James Stephens. He promised it over and over. And he was able to use that as an excuse for it. We didn't do anything because they knew what was coming. It was one of those backfired slightly on the British, I suppose. It also exposed the fact that they knew far more than they let on. In America, we have open recruitment in the Union and Confederate armies. Far more in the Union Army, about 140,000 in the Union Army. These numbers have been re-evaluated more recently, but about 140,000 in the Union Army. And John O'Mahony was they raised a hell of a lot of money and spent a hell of a lot of money on themselves, actually. They had the Fenians had a big headquarters in a brownstone in New York, costing a fortune. And unsurprisingly, there was concerns over there was very much associated transparency in the accounting of the Fenians. But I don't like to deal with money, like fair ones. Not using, talking about, sorry. I should clarify that. In America, the head center of the American movement was a guy called John O'Mahony. And in a very real rhetorical flourish, he published an open memorandum, an open statement that calling as a call to arms. He said, the real power, numerical, physical and moral that we have now, with resources for operating against the tyrant British enemy, we have now more than Irishmen have ever had in their palmiest of days. So he said, look, we're really well poised here. This is, you're talking end of 1863, start of 1864, before the US Civil War finishes in April of the following year. So it's a real call to arms. This illustrates the degree to which the Fenians envisioned themselves as converting the Irish-American soldiers into a mass liberation force, ready to recross the Atlantic and drive out the British tyrant with one swift military blow. I'd argue that a transatlantic movement like this requires a tightly integrated defensive system for the whole island. And this is exactly what the Irish executive tried. Here's what General Sir Hugh Rose, the crazy guy, commanding general in Ireland, proposed to the Lord Lieutenant. He said, if these steamers, the Royal Navy all over the place, and I'll talk about them in a second, if these steamers or gunboats watching the line of coast in question were to make signals to the police and coast guard watching the same coast on shore, if they should get a sight of the movements of the Fenian steamers, the police and coast guard would repeat the signal to the interior, whose troops stationed so as to be able to make the shortest lines to the point of the coast where the arms or men might be disembarked, might seize them. So the idea is, very self-consciously, that all these organisations are designed to work together. The Royal Navy won't do it on its own, the Army won't do it on its own, the police can't do it on their own. But if they all work together, the defensive system will be far more coherent. So probably the best place to start then was working from the outside inwards and just thinking a little bit about the Navy, about those gunboats. Gunboat diplomacy is a phrase you still hear bandied about the newspaper, and Lord Palmerston was one of the guys who came up with it as the Foreign Secretary. He was Prime Minister as well in the early 1860s. And just to give you an idea, now this is a small segment of the coast. It hasn't come out very clearly on the picture, unfortunately. Small segment of the coast. Cork, obviously, Holborn, County Cork was the centre of the Royal Navy in Ireland, and there's a cordon of ships. It's not hermetically sealed because Ireland it just doesn't suit that. There's so many places to land on the Irish coast, but there's ships out there at sea, but also coming into dock in the harbours. They're stopping in regularly to different places. If you look at the ship's log, you say, they were here for a day and then there for another day or whatever. And you could argue that they were more effective and more efficient when they were in port, not going anywhere, as visual signs of British power. John Mitchell in the 1840s wrote very clearly that the Royal Navy, the fact that they had to come to Ireland at all, was a symbol that the Irish state, the embryonic Irish state, was really on the up. Because look, they have to send the Navy here, they're so frightened of us. So the appearance of these ships had a big impact. Now, this is it has come out brilliantly on the slide, a reaction to the British warships. Now this is from the Boston Pilot newspaper, the big Catholic newspaper in Boston. And what it does, it kind of gives an illustration of how effective and how widespread these activities were being reported. Because the Skibbereen Eagle has an article saying, some people were really reassured by the arrival of the ships. And if you look at the very last bit, that some of the rebels are rather disheartened to see the cutting-edge British Royal Navy technology appearing off the coast of Ireland and scaring the crap out of you. And this is going over to Ireland, and this cutting appears in this and many other cuttings about the Royal Navy reporting appears in some of the scrapbooks that the Irish executive politicians had. They kept to see how effective what they were doing was. So this is something which goes back and forth. These stories of the Royal Navy appearing and scaring people go back and forth across the Atlantic. There had been a big visit. Does anyone remember when the USS JFK came to Dublin in 1996? Anyone remember that? And all the lads descended on town. I was about 18, a very spotty 18-year-old, and all my female friends went into town to see the lovely sailors in their white uniforms. I couldn't compete with them at all. It was terrible. But the Channel Squadron, under a guy called Vice Admiral Sidney Dacres, had come to Dublin and brought the brand new ironclad ships. The HMS Warrior was the cutting edge ship of its day, built in 1861. They brought it to Dublin, they brought it to Belfast, and showed it off as a sign of the wooden walls of the Royal Navy were now defunct. It was now the iron walls of the Navy. They were there to step in. And of course they celebrated suitably and had plenty of dinners and looked after the sailors very well, shall we say, euphemistically, as you do. And here's how the Admiral viewed what he was doing. He said, it's the most important thing that the fleet he commands should visit every part of Great Britain and Ireland, because the more the ships are shown, the more they will be understood, and the more they are understood, the more they will be trusted. You could add to that, the more they will be feared. He said it was important for them to come to Ireland, quote, because no one there had any idea of the vast size, tremendous armament, and titanic power of the ironclad ships of the squadron. This was told to the mayor of Belfast. I don't mention it just because there's someone in Belfast talking about good shipping. I'm mentioning the word Titanic, but because they're going out of their way to show off. It's winning hearts and minds. Sending the bands on shore all over the country. Bringing, one estimate has 18 to 20,000 visits from people like you and me going to visit the ships in harbour, just like we did when the USS JFK came in 1996. Looking at the ship's library, looking at the armaments, looking at the Marines on board going through their drill. It's really hard to quantify that. You can't say that stopped 17.5 Fenians from invading Ireland. So you have to suggest that this is a cumulative defensive effort. One of the things that's nearly always forgotten about, and I feel really bad for them, is the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard in Ireland from 1858 onwards was a naval reserve. Does anyone want to guess how many Coast Guards there were in Ireland? Huh? Let's chop it down the middle. There was 1,377 of them, which is the equivalent of 2 regiments of the British Army. These are guys who went off on naval training every year. And they were, here's the numbers. They were stationed in 257 locations. The Fenians boasted that they've identified 300 possible landing spots. I would suggest that most of these would be covered by the Coast Guard, the quasi-naval reserve. They're all over the coast. You couldn't go anywhere without bumping into the Coast Guard. And they had functions to do with smuggling, but also functions to do with identifying ships and the flags of ships and controlling that area. They'd be kind of the threshold guys. The Navy is out trying to dominate the sea, and the Coast Guard, they even extended the range of the Coast Guard searches to 3 miles inland. The Coast Guards would go and search 3 miles inland before their jurisdiction was taken away. So, these things we're talking about sealing this stuff off pretty coherently. Another very important tactic, and this was always very important for liberal Britain under a liberal government, was the suspension of habeas corpus. Now, habeas corpus is the Latin term for, bring me the body of so-and-so. But the Habeas Corpus Act, if you suspend it, you're allowing internment. And before the Fenians had a chance really to get the ball rolling, in February 17th, 1866, the Irish executive, under pressure from a lot of the local magistrates, a lot of the landed gentry, these guys who had the most to lose, they were terrified of losing their claim on Ireland. And they pretty much strong-armed the Irish executive, the Lord Lieutenant, the big meeting in town, and they all turned up and demanded action from the army, but also the suspension of habeas corpus. And with these arrests, within 10 weeks, 692 Fenians had been interned. A proportion of these were Irish Americans who had returned. Some of them were about the same proportion were British, Irish people living in Britain who'd returned to Ireland, and then another chunk of them were Irish born. Interestingly, the Irish American situation caused a lot of problems because the British government would not recognise the process of naturalisation. If you were born a British citizen, in other words, if you were born in Ireland and you went to America and became an American citizen, as far as the British government were concerned, you were still British. So you could still be done for treason. And this is really important. It wasn't until 1871 with the Treaty of Washington that this was sorted out. And this is one of the things that the Irish Americans tried to really push the Fenians. Like, these are American citizens. They're going to the Secretary of State, a guy called Seward. They're going to the President Johnson, and meeting him and saying, look, you've got to support us. Look what they're doing to these American citizens. But it wasn't as simple as all that. So it gives it a legal loophole. And you'll even see, this is the one on the right there is King Punch and Gladstone. And you might not be able to see it, but King Punch, who's the character of Punch magazine, the satirical magazine, he's literally standing on the suspension of habeas corpus. But the guy he's arrested is a guy who's dressed, he's an Irish Fenian, and we can see from the physiognomy, from this is the point at which we're beginning to see Irish people represented as in simian terms like apes. That he's dressed he's got the shamrock, but he's got an American Civil War hat on. So he's the real threat. And the Irish executives consistently said, no matter who, whether it was the Conservatives or the Liberals, they always said, oh, it's really the Irish Americans we're trying to get rid of. There's not really much Fenian problem in Ireland from the Irish form. It's the Irish Americans. They're the scapegoats. We're going to blame them. And then we can do what we want. Once we have them out of prison, that's grand. And a lot of these guys, in order to keep the American government happy, a lot of the Irish Americans were just kind of quietly released in groups of 2 or 3 on the promise that they would feck off back to the States. They were driven down, guarded by the Royal Marines, put on ships, and off they went. And they exported the problem, which is a pretty effective tool, to be honest with you. One thing that I've spent a lot of time in the last year or so looking at, too much time really, my supervisors give out to me, is the way in which the army operated in Ireland. And just to give you an idea, just look at the last numbers, are the only ones important here. You've got, in Ireland, say 1864, about 20,000 soldiers. This would grow slightly, and I'll show you in a second. But about a third of them were infantry regiments, about a third of them were depot regiments, which are kind of training regiments and retired soldiers. A big chunk of them, nearly 10%, were Royal Artillery, and there was no ever really Fenian artillery. That's a thing that never really happened. And 18%, a pretty sizable percentage of these is cavalry. That's going to be really important when we get to flying columns, and we have to go when the British Army have to go and sweep up the Fenians from the hills. Okay, so that's roughly how it's divvied up. They didn't want to be seen to be too quick to ask for reinforcements of the army, because that made it look like they might be panicking. So the political fallout from asking for reinforcement might actually be more damaging than having the extra soldiers close by. So you see that there's kind of it's a cyclical thing, because loads of soldiers end up going from all over Britain to the Curragh for training in the summertime. It's one of the best military training camps in all of the British Empire at the time, and recognised so from the mid 1850s onwards. So there's a little peak every year, but very clearly 1866-67 there is an additional usually about 2 regiments in and out that are being used. And so what the trick was, rather than saying, oh please give us reinforcements, there'd be a normal troop rotation, and they'd just be a little bit slow in letting the guys who are supposed to leave go. I mean, it's a fairly sly thing to do, but effective politically. Oh no, they're supposed to be there. We're just waiting for a ship to free up, and then we'll send those guys off to Halifax, Nova Scotia, or Bermuda, or Jamaica, or wherever they're going. Don't get too bogged down there. The other funny element of this is that the numbers don't really tell the whole story about the British Army in Ireland. This is something I spent a lot of time on. It's also about where they are. And I suppose if you think about it yourself, 10 soldiers 1 mile away is probably an awful lot more scary than 100 soldiers 10 miles away, or 1,000 soldiers 100 miles away. Yeah. So it's not just how many there are, it's where they are. Also, militarily speaking, if you have an artillery battery just left by itself, that's potentially very damaging to your enemy, but they're sitting ducks. Artillery isn't designed to go by itself, is it? It has to have infantry to support it, otherwise the horses come around, and before you can turn the big guns around, you're gone. And your artillery can be captured. This is a map of Limerick City in 1867. And you can see that the barracks are kind of spotted all over the place. The artillery barracks is about a mile away from the new barracks where the infantry were. So one of the things that General Rose does is he says, right, we have to sort this out, lads. We have to start bringing the cavalry and the infantry and the artillery together. And they do that in Clonmel, in Ballincollig, in a number of different places. They kind of reorganise it. And to stop that infiltration, they move the most vulnerable regiments around. So here's what it's like. This took me absolutely ages. A lot of data input for this. It was a bit tedious, but I think it's effective. You'll see that in 1864, before the real threat has been acknowledged, the clumping of the army is very centralised. You have Cork, Fermoy, this fellow here is Newbridge and the Curragh together, because Newbridge is where the cavalry were. And this is all the different barracks in Dublin, obviously very heavily populated, and a few smatterings elsewhere around the place, Cork Harbour, Limerick City, and so on. Athlone was another big place for them to go. But if you follow this through, I'll show you 4 maps, and then if you need to see them again, you can ask me. Watch how the distribution changes. That's a year later, 13 months later, and this is the rising. So you can see that the coast gets an awful lot more attention, and the average size of the detachments, it goes from, you've got maybe 1,000, 2,000 guys in the Curragh. They're not much of use, so you take 500 of them out and you spread them out over the countryside. So they're nearer where they need to be. At the point of the rising, within 2 days of the absolutely failed rising in starting March '67, they established flying columns. This is a really weird graph, but what it shows is that by 1867 you have nearly 80 different clumps of soldiers around the country. Now, militarily that's not great because they're isolated and they're easy to defeat. But the flip side of that is they're there. They're seen and they can move around fast. The average number of the new detachments, they don't tend to put them out anything smaller than about 100. But they established these things called flying columns. And this is one of these great things. I spent a couple of very weird but interesting days in Houston Station. All the archives of the train companies, the Great Western Midlands Railways, are there. And they've got all the data, huge amounts of data, huge amounts of genealogical data as well about families worked on the railways. But a lot of the British administration of Ireland was dependent on these infrastructures, on the physical railways. And you can track the amount of money that the government was spending on the railways, moving soldiers around the place for these flying columns and during the habeas corpus suspension to go and get the guys. And you can literally, pound for pound, say, pretty emphatically I think, that they were using the railways as very powerful deterrents, and to go and, the railway was used as a focal point, and the trains would stop, special trains put on in March 1867, 10 carriages with a guide engine in front in case the Fenians had pulled up the train line, as they had done in a few places, Duff, for example. Really well thought out, really well structured. And then from the train line, from the arteries of the train line, the cavalry would be used to go off into the countryside and sweep the Fenians. And one of the things the general says, in fact it's one of the lower generals, Cunningham, says, literally we had soldiers in places where they'd never seen soldiers before, on the sides of mountains. In the back and beyond, going in, raiding a little cottage that had never seen a policeman, let alone a soldier. And the redcoats come and puts the fear of God up them, so to speak. And so it's not just how many soldiers there are. That tells you something, yeah, but it doesn't tell you nearly the whole picture of how important that defensive structure was in Ireland. I don't want to go on too much longer than this, but there was one other thing which goes back to this problem of deterrence, and this is the militia. Now, the militia was disbanded in the early part of the century and had been started back up in the 1850s because of the Crimean War. The fear was that the militia, the local lads all getting involved, while it was controlled predominantly by former soldiers and by local justices of peace or deputy lieutenants or members of parliament even, controlling the different militia regiments, the fear was that they'd be the most infiltrated. So they didn't call them out to train for fear that bringing them together would cause or spark a rising. And the Lord Lieutenant, quite politically astutely, wrote in the Irish Times. He said, "It was thought an unwise thing and most unfair to the militia to call them together at a time when the barracks, which usually received them, were filled with regular troops, and expose them to the temptation of the Fenian agents, who the government knew had directed their attention, especially, though it believed with limited success, to the corruption of the Irish militia." So they decided not to call them out. So this is a perfect example of the dog that didn't bark. We don't know what would have happened, but they took the precautions ahead of time. Now this cost nothing to the government, because they would have had to pay them anyway, but it had a huge impact in Irish society, because if you've got a regiment of 500 or 600 militiamen coming to your town, and you're a shopkeeper, or you're the guy who supplies the uniforms, or you're being paid a bounty to go and do that, that's a major economic loss to your area. You're talking the order of £40,000. And this training suspension continued on for 5 years. You're talking about 150, 160, 170,000 pounds sterling loss to the Irish economy because of this. So the balancing up these political, economic and military issues and making these snap decisions in their counterinsurgency roles, which I would argue are very, very significant for controlling how Ireland is governed. The last time I gave a talk, my uncle Ian was in the audience, and he said to me, "Jappers, the Christian Brothers told us the IRB lost because it snowed." hopefully I've convinced you that there was slightly more to it.
The dependence of Ireland economically on the British, have had any influence in it?
Yes, in fact, the Royal Navy was a big economic input. A whole series of delegations went down from Cork. A guy called an MP called John Francis Maguire was involved in going over consistently trying to get extra money. One of the things that Ireland had been promised in 1800, when the Act of Union was being passed, is that Ireland would now begin to see the economic benefit of the British state's institutions coming to Ireland. That didn't pan out, especially with the Navy. I'm trying to remember, it wasn't John Mitchell, it was one of the young Irelanders had done a calculation of his own that in 1843 only 10,000 out of something like £7.5 million in the Navy estimates was earmarked for Ireland. But in 1865-66, this delegation managed to go over and get a commitment from the government and the Royal Navy to invest £250,000 in the docking facilities in Holborn County in the Cork Harbour. And so the idea, now some of this was done with Irish convict labour, let's not kid ourselves, but some of it was paid and some of it was, they're quarrying stone and doing all kinds of things. Victualling, which is the Navy word for getting all the food for the various ships that would stop in, and of course Cork Harbour is strategically amazingly placed. The phrase was Queenstown for orders for the Navy and for merchant Navy ships as well. That amount of money circulating in and around Cork Harbour would have been enormously economically beneficial to the locals. And of course, you can put that in counterinsurgency terms as well and say, you want people not to rebel against you, they're not going to bite the hand that feeds them, or they're going to do that very reluctantly. Yeah. They'll take some extra amount of persuasion if they're getting the money for it. So you can look at the amount that's spent on barracks, look at the amount that's spent on the militia, look at the amount that's spent on the Navy. And if you track those numbers, the money, they always say in those TV shows, the cop shows, follow the money. And they're usually right, McGonagall, whatever. They're usually right. But if you follow where the money's being spent, you can see that it does have a big impact on counterinsurgency. Ironically, of all the counties in the UK and Ireland in the period from after the Napoleonic War to 1840, the county that proportionally provided the most named officers in the Royal Navy. Anyone want to guess? Tipperary. Cork was second. Proportionally, by their population. The big Irish ascendancy families, as they ran out of money, a lot of the younger sons and the brothers-in-law and so on would end up going off to the Navy. Solid career, see the world, get venereal disease, come home, and you've got a story to tell. But it is really, follow the money and you'll see how this stuff all works.
Would there have been a secret service fund? Would there have been?
There was a relatively small secret service fund. Yeah, there was a kind of a black fund, and that goes back to the political policing. The Inspector Mallon was one of the guys involved in this, and Donald McCracken has an interesting biography of him, and the title of it is Defeating Ireland with the £5 note. That the informers, for relatively little money, were feeding Dublin Castle all the information they needed. In one of the Fenian invasions of Canada, one of the most successful ever British spies, a guy called Henri Le Caron, was basically quartermaster general of the invasion. And he was in charge of locating all the equipment, and he was a British infiltrated British spy. So there were some very strong economic motivations for providing for these kind of funds. They weren't always as successful as they were let on, partly because, and this would be more so I suppose in the early 1880s, if someone comes to you and says, I've got lots of information, give me some money, how much are you going to trust that? Are they just telling you, I know this guy, he's going to come and attack you, give us £100? It gets very, very hard. Anyone who watches those CIA movies from the 1980s, it's very hard to trust the reliability of that information, but there was certainly a provision made there, and it was topped up at one stage, I think in late 1866, they sent over a bit extra money. I think it was about £5,000 as a float.
Yeah.
You know, I'd have to check that number, but it was in and around that amount.
This is kind of like a bit of an offshore question, but it's to do with the Treaty of Washington.
Yeah.
So, like you're saying that in this treaty, if anybody was an Irish American citizen,
Yeah.
they shouldn't have been. The British couldn't actually touch them for treason.
Kind of. What it turns out as is that the American government had consuls in Ireland.
Yes.
So there's a consul in Belfast, there's a consulate in Dublin, and a consulate in Cork. If you were arrested and thrown into Kilmainham jail and you didn't know what what had happened to you, or if a wife wanted to know what had happened to her husband, if they were American citizens, they could appeal to the consul in Dublin, who reported to the American minister to the Court of St. James. At this stage was a guy called Adams. The consul in Dublin was a guy called William West, was his name. And Eastman, I think, was in Cork. And so they would be able to go in and talk to the guy and maybe provide a bit of legal advice or provide funds, maybe to stop it even getting to the point of trial. Because the whole point of internment is you don't have to be tried. So they could work what you'd call, I suppose, diplomatic back channels to try and get this stuff sorted. So that's what most of the Irish Americans were just looking for help from the consul to get them out, to get them sprung from the internment and off home. But yeah, technically, then you can't be done for treason. This is a time really when one of the reasons the Americans were captured is because they wore very different clothing. They had different accents. Their caps and their boots, particularly, were giveaways, and because all the reports say they were seen to be sauntering around Dublin like they owned the place, which they probably felt like they did. And so they were easy targets to pick up. And then, so trying to get rid of those guys was the real issue, not so much treason. There was a lot of court-martials within the army, but a lot of these cases, there were commissions of inquiry, no, that's not right, commissions of inquiry is the wrong term. There were special commissions to try the guys from the Irish People newspaper, and some special commissions in Cork as well to try some of these guys. But the vast majority of these guys never saw the inside of a courthouse.
Yeah, no, it's just interesting you mentioned that because you know the whole thing with Thomas Clark in 1916.
Yeah,
was an
naturalised American citizen, yeah.
So like, there wasn't, what I'm trying to get at is like, there wasn't anything to do with the Treaty of Washington for him, was there?
There would have been a so you're talking 45,
Yes.
50 years after the Treaty of Washington, so the international diplomacy had come on an awful long way,
Okay.
and the kind of the inverted commas the relationship between Britain and America at the time, in 1916, of course, is fundamentally different. So they'd be far more likely to look over that stuff during World War I than they would have been at this stage. Britain and America were at each other's throats a lot of the time during the American Civil War. Britain had fitted out commerce raiders. There's like the Alabama, and there was the Trent affair, where an American federal ship boarded a British flagged vessel to arrest two Confederate agents that were on their way to Britain to try and get British support. Consistently, the Confederates had, for historical reasons, the War of Independence, the War of 1812. There's very good historical reasons why the British weren't that fond of the Americans at this stage. And so the Fenians were trying to prey on that shaky relationship. And this was one of the ploys they used to do that. Later down the line, I think the political backdrop, the political landscape has changed an awful lot. So I'd be very wary of making direct causal links. Now, if you were to ask a very rigid civil servant in the Foreign Office or the Colonial Office or the Home Office, they might have given you a different answer at the time. Oh, this is the official line we're taking. But you can be guaranteed the politicians were having their back channels. How the habeas corpus suspension arrests were played out in Ireland was basically what happened was an instruction came from Seward, the US Secretary of State. And you can trace this, I've done it, you can trace it through all the correspondence in the archives. Instructions coming from Washington to London, to Dublin, to the consul in Dublin, and from the Foreign Office, a guy called Clarendon, the Earl of Clarendon from the Foreign Office, a guy who had been the Lord Lieutenant during the famine. the Earl of Clarendon, back to the Irish Lord Lieutenant saying, just keep the Americans happy, get rid of these lads as quick as you can. So you're talking about diplomatic back-channeling as much as you're talking about weapons and guns and pressure. But I think you have to look at those things in a balanced way. Yeah.
Well, actually, that brings me to the point I want, because I mean, there you can see where the political forces, if you like, were already, and probably had been before, but maybe they were increasingly going to be more and more important as a force in the arena. Now, obviously, this counterinsurgency was effective, and so it wasn't just happenstance for the British people. It was they worked at it. Have you looked at whether the role, maybe the effect of counterinsurgency had at that stage, as well as the burgeoning political development in Ireland in moving the fight, the Irish cause, away from a more military, more rebel terrorist fighting to a more political?
Well, what happens is, and you see this within the historiography, within the way this is written about. In virtually all the books about this, what happens is once the rising has failed, all the attention of what happens with the Fenians shifts from Ireland to the British Fenians and to America, and what the Fenians are doing in those locations. So what happens is that people pretty much ignore the fact that for another year after the rising, the British Army was still pretty much in the same positions, that they held their ground before they reconcentrated, before the threat was gone. And I suppose in terms of the influence that this had, it kind of gets overtaken, because in December 1867, well, you have the Clerkenwell bombing, and you have the Manchester martyrs, and so that becomes the story becomes kind of hijacked by these highly politicised trials. Larkin, Allen, and O'Brien are the three guys who are killed on the foot of these events, and they become the focal point for almost everything that happens after that. So people aren't thinking in the same terms. There are some guerrilla activities that continue in Cork after the rising, and the army stays down there a little bit longer. So it becomes very, very difficult to track. Michael Davitt was involved as a Fenian in the 1860s, and he becomes a very important political ally to Parnell. But that period of transition is very, very difficult. It's very difficult to say, yes, exactly at this point the counterinsurgency has this effect. Exactly at this point, people are beginning to say, oh, this is hopeless. There's one great letter in the Boston Pilot newspaper, which kind of gives a sense of this. I'll quote it to you very, very quickly. I think this is as early as 1865 in Boston. Fenians are saying something like this. They write to the newspaper and say, "Do intelligent Fenians seriously believe that their organisation can accomplish the Herculean task which they have proposed to themselves? Whence are to come the mighty fleets and armies, the skillful generals, and all the materials of war necessary to cope with the powerful enemy? We are told, indeed, by embryo orators, that the people of Ireland are arming. The whole battalions and brigades of Fenians are, at the present moment, drilling in that country. But who is simple enough to believe such stuff? Or that any organisation can exist there for any length of time unseen by the Argus-eyed British government?" So the Argus is the mythological figure with 1,000 eyes who can watch everything. And so you can see there's a exuberant optimism about the Fenians at times, but there's also a gritty realism of they realise that this really isn't going to work. The reports they're getting about the Navy and the Army in Ireland are really, really discouraging. And in fact, the rising in many ways is cut off because of what the British Army does in England. A former Colcarden betrays the fact that the Fenians were planning to raid Chester Castle, the arsenal of Chester Castle, put the stuff on trains and bring it over to Dublin. So there's a lot of pessimism going around as well, that no matter what we try, it isn't going to be enough. And the only alternative then is constitutional agitation. And it's not long before Isaac Butt, it's 1871, the repeal campaign. You're talking within 4 years, most of these guys are out of prison. Most of the serious guys are out of prison or have been transported in the last set of transportations. And the guys who are involved in this, they either fall off the map altogether, become really radicalised like O'Donovan Rossa and his dynamiters, or slip kind of logically and gently enough into constitutional politics. The rate at which that happens is different for the different people involved, but how would you feel if all your best military efforts, all these great potentials, the 200,000 odd Irish guys, if in the American Army, if these guys weren't able to get it done, what other choice have we got? And it's 1875 when Parnell is elected as a 29-year-old. So, you know, and up the bigger
so they really
and
did
boys.
us a favour, didn't they?
I don't make value judgments, I understand the facts. So if you want to say it did in favour, that's a perfectly reasonable interpretation of it. At what cost with the other thing, and that's always a question. I would try and avoid the judgment on it rather than. But I think what is interesting about this in terms of all the commemoration is that there's going to be very little said about 1867 when the 150th anniversary comes up. Well, maybe 1917 there won't be. There'll be nothing left really because they'll have done everything else. They need to do that, but it kind of filters in a little bit to the 1916 issue. You know, there's so many Irish people involved in all of these organisations: Coast Guard, Police, the Army, the Navy, the Marines. I didn't mention the Royal Marines. They flood into Ireland, into Cork Harbour to release the British soldiers to do their stuff. There's Royal Marines stationed in Pariscourt. Lord Pariscourt asks for the Marines from Dunleary Harbour to be sent up to him just to keep him safe. Just especially for me, send up the Marines, and they do, because it's a political problem. So, looking at the kind of the genesis of how these things panned out in 1867 gives us, at least I think, some insight into the kinds of strategic questions that the British government is going to be asking in terms of responding to 1916, in terms of responding to later things. The trains had improved, the telegraph had improved somewhat. The radio, I suppose, would have been one major thing, but in a lot of ways, the same physical infrastructure is in place in Ireland. And so we're beginning to see now, with 1916 studies tending to give a far more balanced approach as to what the British Army and all their Irish contingent, what they were doing in 1916. To give the flip side of the story, so you're giving at least a balanced side. You tend to get even less of that in 1867. And so I suppose that's the gap I'm trying to fill. Does that answer your question? Probably I've talked all the way around it. Which is the classic.
Can I ask a question that is it true that for the Fenians that were arrested in 1867 that they took all their photographs? And if
Yes.
so, where are they?
And where are they? It's again, if you want to go and make a value judgment about this, you could say that the first mass recording of arrests occurred with the suspension of habeas corpus. Interestingly, the returned Irish Americans were the ones who objected most to having their pictures taken.
Right.
There's a very good article called Fenians in the Frame. The name of the author I can't remember, but basically all of those records, because they took photographs, they took descriptions, physical descriptions at the time of arrest and release, so you can see the impact of the imprisonment on the guys, their social background, their employment record, all this kind of stuff. And so you've got over 1,000 of these sitting in the National Archive.
In the National Archive?
Yeah, in Bishop Street. The folders on the right-hand side is going to the door.
Okay.
You can spend your life trawling through these things.
Yeah.
It's very interesting to see the documentation and look at the.
No?
They are quite well indexed. They're much better indexed than a lot of the other Fenian papers are.
Okay.
The Fenian arrest papers are reasonably good, but it's a backhanded benefit to us because we now know, because the arrests were so successful and so widespread, we know an awful lot about the guys who were involved in this. So it's kind of the same thing. Or did they do us a genealogical favour ahead
That's
of a...
where I'm coming from.
But an awful lot of that stuff is in there.
In
You'll find kind of catalogues of the exact arrest and release date, where they were, what prison they were in overall catalogues, and then each thing will have the file number.
Photographs are there,
But there's not photographs of everybody.
right.
From there, a significant intelligence acquiring operation, which was repeated later on by many other.
Yeah, it was a part of an ongoing. I wouldn't say it was.
No, but obviously it was a step up.
Yeah, it was an escalation of it. But it's just very interesting to see. It's the kind of data collection that we're now very worried about. And the whole habeas corpus suspension. I mean, John Stuart Mill, the famous 19th century philosopher turned MP, one of his second ever speech in Parliament was giving out about the habeas corpus suspension, how it was illiberal, it was un-English, it curtailed the freedoms of people who are supposed to be equal citizens of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And so it was so that he saw it as fundamentally flawed, till all the other politicians said, "Will you ever shut up, John? Like, hop on. You're never going to get anywhere in politics if you go on like that." And he shut up. He came to his senses. So it is a big part of this story of data gathering that becomes such an important part of later policing. I think that's certainly true.
You were saying that you're very interested in the history of the Navy,
Yeah.
how the Navy was used. Came across a book where there was a little piece about the Navy on the Blasket Islands. There's a very good book called On an Irish Island, written by an American author, actually, and he talks about where, I think it was around the turn of the century, Thomas O'Crane simply mentions it, and that they raided the Blaskets on behalf of the local landlord.
Yeah, they would have been involved in the 1840s. They were the Royal Navy, when they turned up on the coast, the tides suddenly were magically paid.
Yeah.
Because they were afraid, and they were involved in transporting like the revenue police out to the islands pretty consistently in the 1840s and 50s. Yeah. And so they had a kind of a constabulary function of just the practicalities of getting around the islands.
It was brought up by the local MPs that what they did was actually illegal, that they should not have supported the landlord in this manner, that the police were perfectly adequate for to do it. But the Navy was actually involved in evicting the people, in demolishing some of their houses, and in confiscating their currachs, which they depended on for their livelihood.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The Irish executive, technically nobody in Ireland could order the Navy to do anything. How it worked is that if the Irish executive, if the Lord Lieutenant wants something done, he makes, and it gets very tedious to track the correspondence when you're trying to do the archival work on this. The Irish executive sends over a requisition to the Admiralty. The Admiralty sends a letter to the Admiral, or usually Rear Admiral in Cork. He says, "Can you do this? Have you got any ships available?" If they can, they go ahead and do it. The correspondence then doesn't go from Dublin to Cork. It goes from Dublin to London. Sorry, Cork to London to Dublin. They say, "Yes, we will do that. We will accede to your requisition." Oftentimes they went above and beyond and just basically, at times of difficult communications or whatever, they'd say, "Listen, that ship is there at the disposal of the Lord Lieutenant, or at the disposal of the local Justice of the Peace, or whoever it happened to be in control of the district militarily or politically." So they couldn't actually order the Navy to do anything. But the Navy was well used to doing this kind of thing all over the globe. I mean, you're talking about gunboat diplomacy, the Royal Navy going up the rivers in Africa, or involved in suppressing the Maori rebellion, all over the place. There's a Maori word for Fenian, So this was something that, or the suppression of the slave trade. This is something, intervention was what the Navy did. And also, interestingly, the Navy was a big intelligence gathering operation, because they could move around with freedom. If you want to get from Cork to Lough Swilly, you're much faster in a ship than you are on the Irish roads in the 1860s. I'll tell you that. So, the way in which that is involved, the Navy is involved in Irish life, in some ways it's very invidious, and in some ways it's very practical. Famine relief distribution, for example. There was a thing called the Relief Squadron in the 1840s. Set up 8 or 9 vessels at one stage, bringing famine relief all around the country. Then the American Navy sent over a couple of ships. They offloaded. Who does the actual deliveries? The Royal Navy. So it's a give and take thing the whole time. But that relationship is really underexplored throughout the 19th century, which is good for me because I can write it. I have an article coming out on it at the Royal Navy in the 1840s in the Mariner's Mirror in November, if you want to read it. Nice maps for that one. Anybody else? 40 into submission.
The US Fenians had a different take on Ireland than the Fenians on the ground. To me, they were always either one step ahead or 2 steps back.
It was great. Part of the problem was there was real mistrust between them. They tended to really mistrust what James Stephens said. Now, within American Fenianism, there's a split between what's called the Roberts wing, which is the guys that want to go off and invade Canada as a diversion, I suppose, to stimulate a war, and the O'Mahony wing, they're the guys who want to go straight back to Ireland. And so even within Fenianism in America, you know, the old Irish history joke, the first item on the agenda is the split. The Fenians had this down. There was all kinds of internal difficulties and congresses here and congresses there and factions coming out. So that there was mistrust across the Atlantic, and they weren't always singing to the same hymn sheet, but that was also the case within America, that they were mutually contradicting and seemed to be, you know, to the point at which actually a lot of intelligence that's going to the British consul in New York and to the British minister in Washington is coming from people who are so disaffected with the other branch that they say, screw it, or, you know, I'm going to give the information that will stop bloodshed down the line. So, you know, that's really undercuts the Fenian efforts when you see the large rift in American Fenianism.
Because they're still fighting it out, coming up to 1914, 1916, and they had a totally different take. Because I think your man McGarry, if he had his way, there would have been no rising in Dublin at the time, because he reckoned that the structure wasn't for it in Ireland and that.
And there's some sense in that argument, in the same way as there's some sense in saying what seems like a daft idea to go and invade Canada. That seems stupid, but in the context of this heightened tension between America and Britain, actually makes it quite a lot of sense in some ways. Just give something for the American politicians who always wanted the Irish vote, after all. In the midterm elections in 1866, they wanted the Democrats and Republicans both vying for Irish-American political candidates and for support. Tammany Hall and the boys. That this becomes very, very important, and the possibility of it tipping over into a conflict that the Irish could exploit was the real reason. It wasn't to have a military victory per se. So these are kind of the larger kind of the grand strategy, the diplomacy issues that all these military events are happening under. And I'd say the one informs the other. The more effective the defences in Ireland, the more likely they are to become discouraged, the more likely there is to be a split in the American Fenians. That makes sense?
Yeah. Thanks very much, John. It was a great lecture. Thank you. We have a second, just a small little anomaly that occurs each year in one of our months. September we have 2 lectures. So our next one will be Tuesday the 29th of September, back here in the same venue, and that's calligraphy. So I'll be writing to all of you about that. Codes and Catastrophes, David Smith. So be here 7 o'clock, same time here on Tuesday the 29th of September. We'll give you more details of our field trip to, where are we going the field trip again now? Crow Park, yeah. The museum in Crow Park. And we'll have some more information for you about our play, which will be in the Rue Red next year. Because we're going to do a little bit of crowdfunding, in relation to it, in order that we can, people can secure their tickets for the play, and that we will be in some way able to defray our costs before we actually get there at all. So, Gadi Shin Slam. Slam while you keep on your phone.